I'm Idiotech, and today I'm going to review The Witcher 3 for PC. So The Witcher 3 is a massive narrative-driven RPG, right? You play as Geralt, a monster slayer. I mean, if you don't know anything about The Witcher, right, you're essentially this dude who kills monsters for money. That's your deal, right? They explain the lore and everything behind it as you play the game. So the world's like this really dark fantasy place. It's brutal. It's based heavily on medieval history. So if you like Game of Thrones and stuff like that, you'll really like this world. You're not going to make good or bad choices like you would in a BioWare RPG. It's not like that. You make a choice and it's usually bad, okay? Like, everything you do will usually have a negative impact on someone somewhere. It's never good. Good things don't happen in this world, so really the best you can do is try to be as neutral as possible, and that's not always as easy as it sounds. It's a very diverse and rich, mature setting. There's lots of sex, lots of violence, and it's got some of the best storytelling in a game I've seen in recent years. If you just want to know if this game is a good game and whether you should buy it and you've been holding out for some reason just to hear my review, just go buy the game, guys. It's absolutely fantastic. If you want to know why it's a good game, stick around and I'll explain. So, this game, like every other game that ever comes out recently, does have technical issues. Not as bad as most, thankfully. But I have had a few crashes while playing. Nothing serious, just like a couple of crashes, had to restart, save my games pretty often, so it's not a problem. However, other people have reported frequent crashing, black screening, and some people can't even run the game at all. So, my advice to you is just to check the forums, see if your settings and setup are somewhat similar to these other people, and hopefully you don't have issues. Now, that being said, the majority of people aren't having problems, and they are able to play the game without any serious issues. So the people who are having issues, it'll probably get patched out. Most people are doing okay, but just be aware some people are having some pretty serious issues. Another area that's worth mentioning is performance. And as always, AMD cards don't run very well because of whatever reasons. I'm not getting into it, but I have a 4970K and an R9 290, right? And I'm only capable of running on high. I can't run it on ultra. I can run it high and get 60 FPS. Now, even then, it does drop down to 45 in quite a few areas, built-up areas, stuff like that. Now, in this case, NVIDIA users are also reporting performance issues. Now, if you do pick up this game, turn off the hair physics immediately if you're running AMD. And if you're running NVIDIA, unless you're running a Titan or something crazy like that, I'd turn it off as well. Both graphics card manufacturers are working on drivers. NVIDIA did release some, but that caused some problems for some people. Basically, this game is a massive performance hog, and it clearly lacks when it comes to optimization. It doesn't run that well. You know, if you have a very high-end system, you may still not even be able to run it on Ultra. It's very demanding and poorly optimized. That being said, the developers are working on some patches, NVIDIA and AMD are working on some drivers, so hopefully things improve over the next couple of days. It's certainly playable, but you may have to play it on lower settings than you're expecting given the hardware that you have. This is the area with the most amount of contention when it comes to The Witcher 3. So, just a bit of backstory for you if you don't know. Back in 2013, the developers showed off some early footage of the game at E3, and it was extremely impressive. The game on release doesn't look anything like that game, and people are a little pissed off about it. I don't care that much, but other people are, so I'm letting you know. So essentially what resulted was people started claiming that the game had been downgraded, and some are even accusing the developers of misrepresenting their product and saying that they pre-ordered based on that footage, etc., etc. And the developer has since confirmed in a sort of roundabout way where they don't want to admit that they downgraded the game, that they sort of did because consoles weren't powerful enough. Now, this is kind of a deep topic that warrants its own video, but what I will say is this. It's clear that the developers had a vision back in 2013 that they couldn't achieve on the current generation of consoles, so it had to be scaled back. It's obvious when you look at the original footage, which I can't put on the screen because they'll take my video down. It's very unfortunate, and it's a stark reminder that PC gaming will continue to be limited by the consoles for the foreseeable future, and that's because the consoles make money, and the PC apparently doesn't make money, although I would contest that, and so developers have to make games for the consoles, and by doing so, we get crappy PC versions, I guess. That being said, if the developers had not been so eager to show their game off so early, then there wouldn't be a point of comparison, and no one would be complaining because they wouldn't have anything to compare it to, right? And the reason I say that is because The Witcher 3 is a good-looking game, right? It's a good-looking game. So what it gets right are the character models. They're really good. The interiors are good, and the lighting is excellent. All of these things are stunning at times. There are moments in this game where everything comes together to create this wonderful visual experience. The lighting especially really helps to add atmosphere to this game. Things start to fall down, though, when it comes to the environmental detail. The draw distances are incredibly short, and even compared to games like Skyrim, you can't see at all into the distance. You can see maybe like 100, 200 meters, and then it starts to turn into haze and fog. The foliage looks very flat, like very, very flat. It doesn't look very realistic at all. The grasses don't look very realistic at all. It has this sort of flat, lacking in just any kind of visual depth. Like the lighting doesn't seem to affect these objects very well. And then the other thing is that the water shaders are very cartoonish. They're very blue, and that doesn't always suit the world. It can be quite a grim world, and having this bright blue water doesn't really work. They sort of have a very sort of old, last generation sort of look to them. And that's because they had to scale these things down, and it's really obvious. And that's a shame, honestly, because right now the game looks good, but it doesn't look great, and it could have looked great, and now people know what it could have been. It does hurt the overall product as a result.
Challenge me again. Raise your hand, draw your sword, look at me the wrong way, and I'll kill you.
You so sure of that?
Yes.
We shall see.
The voice work in this game is excellent. It's some of the best voice work I've seen in a video game, and it rivals television and film in a way that I've not seen before. Half the time, I feel like I'm watching a show on HBO rather than playing a video game. It's that good. Especially with the choice to use European actors, I really appreciate that. I don't think that fantasy stories based in medieval history should have Americans in them. No offense to anyone who's American out there. It just doesn't fit the tone and the vibe that you're going for. You know, if Game of Thrones was packed full of American actors, it would be weird, right? So I'm really happy to see that. It's hard to provide any concrete examples here without sort of spoiling the plot. But when you've got actors like Charles Dance involved, you know it's going to be good, guys. Like, it is one of the best aspects of this game by far. It's stunning. The music provides a refreshing take on the fantasy genre, which I appreciate, and it does have a very Eastern European feel to it, which is good to see as well. It works well, and it sets the tone for what's often quite bleak. Honestly, this game is a very bleak, somber experience, and it sets the tone well for that. The only real criticism I have is that there's not really enough of it, and you will hear the same songs over and over and over again, especially the battle music. And after playing for 40 hours, which is how long I've played the game right now, it does start to grate after a while. It's hard to criticize the sound work in this game. It's very realistic setting, so most of the sound design just reflects that, you know, it's like there's birds, and there's a man hitting an anvil, and there's swords, you know? I mean, it's hard to get that stuff wrong. In the areas where the game gets more creative, such as monster encounters, it holds up really well, and it helps to create some of the really intense fights in the game, like when you're fighting a griffin, or some of the other creatures I won't spoil for you, but it makes those fights really tense, and the sound effect work done on those monsters in particular, very, very good. So when it comes to the world and the story, it's the strongest area of this game by far. The main story is kind of simple. You're tasked to find a girl named Cyrilla, or Ciri, who's your ward, or sort of your daughter. Not really your daughter, but you raised her. She's someone else's child, but you raised her from birth and trained her and stuff. And she's being tracked down by what's called the Wild Hunt. So I won't spoil the story for you guys at all. You may kind of think that what I've said there, you know, you're trying to find a girl and, you know, whatever. It may sound a bit dull when you compare it to other games where you take on the role of some ultimate badass on a quest to save the world or something. But you kind of be wrong, and the reason I think that is because this narrative choice facilitates the gameplay of an open world. So I'll explain. In my opinion, it's kind of been a failure of many open worlds to task the player with some serious earth-shattering goal, like right out of the gate. And the reason for this is because it destroys the context for the player's actions. So if the world's about to end, right, and I'm wandering around doing a side quest, finding some man some cheese or whatever, you start to ask yourself the question, well, why am I doing this when I should be saving the world, right? And open world games are about exploration and side quest and the random encounters you have on the way. And The Witcher 3 really embraces this idea and gives you a simple task of finding someone in the world, so you have to explore. And in doing so, the player gets to explore freely without always feeling that there's something more important to be doing. And it's a really refreshing approach to open world design and storytelling, and it adds an awful lot to the idea of an open world game, and I love it, honestly. I think it's a really, really unique approach, not to make someone like the ultimate amazing hero and just say, you've got to find this person, and that means exploring the world, which facilitates the point of the game, which is to explore the world. I really like that. Now, obviously I can't go into too much detail regarding the story and the side quests without spoiling it, as I've said, but what I will say is that nothing in this game is as simple as it first appears. You'll be forced to make hard choices at every turn. And the context they provide for even the smallest tasks helps to build an immensely rich and satisfying world. There is no narrative-driven game like it, in my opinion. It has set the bar for what can be done in terms of world building and storytelling in video games, period. There is so much to cover here, guys. I mean, with an RPG, it's kind of difficult to talk about game design because they are known for their depth, right? So I could spend a whole video talking about this. There is a lot to cover, so I'm just going to get through it as quickly as I can. So the first thing we'll start with is combat. Now, I've seen a lot of people complaining about the combat system in this game, and granted the keyboard and mouse control is not the best, and this game was clearly designed for a controller, and that's how I played the game, so keep that in mind. Honestly, though, I think the combat system offers a lot of depth, and it forces the player to think rather than just hacking and slashing their way to, like, victory, essentially, by just killing all the dudes. Like, it makes you think about things. It works like this, essentially. You've got two swords, one for humans and one for monsters. Now, that's a bit contrived, and I don't really see the point of it, but whatever, it's there, it's cool. You have a strong and light attack, and they can be modified based on the direction you hold down. You can dodge and roll, which can be modified based on the direction you hold down. You can block, which will prevent damage, but also stun you slightly so you can't, like, immediately hit back. And then you can parry, and if you do that precisely, it requires precise timing. If you do that precisely, it gives you an opening to counterattack, and you can do significant damage during that time, and you can get critical hits and stuff. You also have signs, which are magical abilities. You can shield yourself, or burn, or stun, or slow, or knock back enemies. And finally, you have items like bombs, and crossbows, and daggers, which allow you to engage enemies at range. Now, when you take all of this in combination with the alchemy system, like oils, for example, that modify your weapons, and then the bestiary that tells you the various weaknesses of each enemy type, it creates what I think is a really incredibly deep system with rewarding combat, and it forces strategy and precision. I don't really understand why people are complaining about it. It could be a control issue, but in terms of the mechanics on offer here, guys, I think the combat system's really enjoyable. That being said, I did play on a slightly more difficulty setting, so there's normal, and I chose to play on hard based on some recommendations from a few people, and I found it great, so I'm not really sure why people are complaining about the combat system. I think it's really good, to be honest. Now, itemization and looting is a big part of an RPG, so we'll quickly cover that as well. Itemization in this game is also quite deep. Various items will give you various stat bonuses, right? Like most other games. As well as combat bonuses, such as the ability to poison or inflict bleed damage, for example, on a target. You can also slot items with runes, which is kind of the equivalent of gems in a game like Diablo, for example, and they'll improve your signs, your magical abilities, and melee attacks and defensive capabilities, right? It's standard fare. Items come with varying degrees of rarity, and the rarer items provide more bonuses. It's just standard RPG system. It's not as fun to find loot in this game as it might be in a game like Diablo, for example, right? But what's here is deep, and it's rewarding nonetheless, and I think it's okay. I mean, a lot of other RPGs haven't got it right at all. Like Dragon Age Inquisition, the itemization in that game was awful. I had no enjoyment getting loot in that game. This game, I am excited when I get a piece of loot. Not as excited as Diablo, but it's not a game centered around loot, and it does it better than most RPGs I've played. Now, one aspect of this game in regards to loot that I will criticize is the complete lack of a theft or stealth system. Now, you can happily just walk into people's homes and just take everything that isn't nailed down without consequence. And I did run into one area, so it isn't entirely absent, but I did run into one area where they said, oh, you're not allowed to steal stuff, right? But you can just walk into literally any person's home and just take all their stuff. And that would be fine if there was a risk associated with doing it, but in its current state, it's kind of immersion breaking, because you'll go up to a guy and he'll give you a contract for like 200 crowns, and you go in his house and steal like 200 crowns worth of stuff and just double your rewards. It's kind of silly. They need to liberally apply this theft system, because I've only seen it once. And if they combined it with maybe a stealth system, so you had to sneak into people's houses at night while they were sleeping and steal their stuff like Skyrim, that would be cool. I think it's kind of missing something in that area there. A stealth/theft system would have been cool to see in an open world game. A lot of people do like stealing stuff in games like this, and it would have been cool to see it. Other than that, though, the itemization in this game's fine. The open world and the exploration aspect of the game is another thing we have to talk about, and I do have some criticisms here. So, in terms of the game's open world, the developers claim that it's an open world game, and I don't agree with them. Unlike games like Skyrim, where there's just one massive map and you walk around it and go anywhere you want, this game requires you to travel between zones, and those zones are very big, but you do have to sit through loading screens to reach them, so that kind of means that it's not an open world game. So I think they've misrepresented their game a little bit in that regard. Now, granted, each of these zones is effectively the size of Skyrim's map. They are huge zones, but it still doesn't make it an open world game. The other aspect of the game that leaves it feeling not so open is the level requirements for content. So like an MMO, for example, you could go anywhere in World of Warcraft, but if you go to a high level zone, you're just going to get killed, right? And it's kind of the same in this. The quest lines have recommended levels, the monsters and bandits have levels, so if you go to an area where you're kind of not supposed to be, you're going to die. This does often lead to you taking what feels like a predetermined path through the content. And it does detract from that feeling of freedom you get in other open world games like Skyrim, for example. With all that said, I like the way it's handled. What the developers have done, or tried to do, is strike a balance between open world design and handcrafted experience that you might find in a more linear, story-driven game. And you don't have the freedom you might get in a game like Skyrim, but what you gain is a much richer and more interesting story, along with a more interesting and developed world, with a focus on, like, you know, characters and storytelling and stuff like that. And I prefer that in my RPGs than maybe the freedom I would get in a game like Skyrim. So, overall, I think exploration in the open world's good. Questing. So that's another thing we have to talk about. This goes on for a while, guys. I'm sorry. Questing falls into sort of 4 categories, right? We got main quests, which are heavily story-driven and push the main plot forward. We got side quests, which are story-driven, heavily so, and sometimes better than the main story. And they serve to flesh out the world rather than the plot. And I really like that about them. Witcher contracts are another thing you can do, which usually involves someone paying you to track down and kill a monster of some kind, and they're fun. And then undiscovered locations, which are sort of question marks on the map, and when you go there, there's treasure or a bandit camp or a cool fight or a place of power that gives you additional ability points. They're like kind of like tertiary quests, I guess, and they're okay. Now, the variety on offer here leads to you essentially never being bored, or at least I wasn't bored. I always wanted to do the next contract because I got to see some cool new enemy type, right? I always wanted to see what happened next in the story, whether it be the main quest or the side quests, and the side quests, as I've said, can be very interesting, right? And I felt compelled to explore all the undiscovered locations in the hope that I'd get some cool piece of gear or, you know, get another ability point. And overall, guys, it feels really expertly handled. Like, in 40 hours of playing the game, I've not felt bored or like, oh, I've got to do this quest because, you know, this guy said go collect 10 bear asses, so now I have to go do that. You don't have that experience when playing this game. Everything has a context. Everything is compelling. Even if it's just small, it's compelling. It's interesting. They make things interesting by giving it context. And it's fantastic. It's one of the best areas of the game. Another thing we have to talk about is crafting. So, the crafting system in this game is kind of just serviceable. There's nothing here you haven't seen a million times before. You collect materials in the world, you take them to a guy. If you've got the correct blueprints, he will make them for you for money. That's basically how it works. One area that's nice is that you can dismantle items. So, for example, if you find a sword that you can't use, you can just dismantle it into components so you can craft, or you can sell it. So that's nice. It gives some sort of value to items other than just gold, and I appreciate it. But again, that's nothing new. A major complaint that I do have is that while you can harvest herbs and leather and those kind of materials, you can't really find a very renewable way to harvest metal. And metal's kind of important for making armor and swords, and you just have to find that in crates or pick it up off guys you've killed. And it would have been nice to be able to actually mine those materials in a more consistent way, because I found myself running out of them a lot. It wasn't a big deal, but it did limit my progression in terms of crafting. So it's a passable system, it does what it needs to do, and not much else. Another thing we have to talk about is alchemy, which The Witcher does slightly differently. If you played the previous games, you'll know what I'm talking about, but for those who haven't, the way it works is this. You can make potions, and they give you buffs to stats. In this case, they regen, they can make you see in the dark, things like that, and you can make oils to coat your weapons, and that will do additional damage versus specific enemy types. Now, the key to this system is that potions are toxic, right? So if you take too many of them during a fight, you'll die. And that's a really nice way to prevent what you get in other games like Skyrim, where you can just chug health potions endlessly during a fight, right? It solves that problem, and it's good, because in the other Witcher games, you couldn't use potions during combat, and that was kind of annoying. And so now you can, but it will kill you if you use too many. It feels perfect to me. I really like it. The one area of complaint that I do have is that when you meditate, your potions are refilled if you have a certain item, which is very easy to obtain. And so if you make a cat potion, for example, which lets you see in the dark, you go to sleep, and it comes back full, like the bottle's full again. So once you've made a potion, if it's in your inventory and you just meditate for 10 minutes, it's fixed. Like, you get all your stuff back. And it kind of nullifies the point of the alchemy system after a while. Like, as you get further and further into the game, you'll find yourself using it less and less and less. And I don't really see why they did that. It seems kind of counterintuitive and strange. So, you know, it's a small complaint, but it's something that's there. Progression. Another thing we have to talk about in an RPG. I'm going to remind myself not to review RPGs in future. The progression system works like this, okay? You level up, you earn ability points, you spend them on talents, like any other RPG ever. There's a bit of a twist, though, to the system in that you're limited to how many talents you can take at one time. And you can sort of augment them a bit with these things called mutagens that will give you maybe like a 50% like health boost, and if you combine them with the right colors, it gives you more. It's a bit contrived, honestly. It's okay. It's not a very exciting system, and one of the key problems with the system is that it doesn't give you many like non-passive unlocks, so you don't get new skills and abilities as you progress. So kind of how you start at level 1 is kind of how you'll be at maximum level. You do get a few extra things, but you don't get that huge sense of career progression and character progression that you get in games like World of Warcraft, where you keep unlocking new abilities and you feel more and more and more powerful, have more things you can do in the late game. That's kind of lacking here, and it would have been nice to see something there. Another issue with progression is an immersion issue, and it's a very small issue, but when you're the Witcher, you're kind of like this guy who's an expert fighter at fighting monsters and humans and stuff. But when you come up against like a guard from a village who's just like some conscripted peasant, but he's level 23, he can just one-shot you, and that feels a little bit immersion breaking at times. It's a very minor complaint, but it's just a problem that you have in this game. So that's pretty much everything to do with game design. Overall, I think game design in this game is either standard or really good, right? So it's like some areas of it are really, really stand out and well done, and other areas are just kind of standard fantasy fare. It does what it needs to do. It works well. People will like it, but it doesn't do anything special, right? Overall, though, I think it's really good. After seeing the 10 out of 10s on GameSpot and the 9.5s on IGN and all over the internet, just 10 out of 10s, perfect game, 9.5, I was very skeptical, if I'm honest, and all those reviews came out like a week before the game even launched. I requested code, and eventually they got back to me 3 days after release and told me they didn't have any code. Apparently they were only giving code out for the PlayStation 4 version as well. So anyway, loads of people got early access to this game and did the reviews, and they all gave it 10 out of 10s and 9.5s. And I thought, well, okay, I've seen this before. It's a big hype train, right? It's going to be a massively overhyped game, and it's ultimately going to be quite disappointing. I am happy to report that I was incredibly wrong in that assumption. The Witcher 3 is honestly quickly becoming one of the best RPGs I've ever played. And that's up there with games like World of Warcraft, which is probably my favorite RPG of all time, Oblivion and Morrowind. And I prefer those games to Skyrim, don't kill me. Oblivion and Morrowind and Skyrim and stuff like that, they're very high on my list. This is starting to overtake those games, okay? That's how good this game is. Now, that said, it isn't Skyrim, okay? If you're looking for Skyrim, that kind of Skyrim experience, you're not going to find that here. What you will find is a very rich and interesting world full of unique characters that sort of all comes together to create like what I believe to be one of the best role-playing experiences of all time. Now, what I mean by that is a story-driven experience. Now, a lot of games like Skyrim, they're very cool in terms of their openness, right? But they're not that deep in terms of the richness of story and characters. They fall down a little bit there. And in terms of direction, you know, and the complexity and intrigue and quests and things like that, they just don't offer as much depth. This game focuses entirely on that. The other stuff, some of the mechanics are a bit standard. There's not huge amounts of innovation in certain areas, but where there is innovation in the voice acting, in the storytelling, in the narrative, in the way that you do quests, like you use your Witcher senses to like detect things, and you do these like detective type quests all the time. All that stuff comes together to create what I feel is seriously one of the best role-playing games ever made. It's really that good. So if you were remotely on the fence about this game, and you like RPGs at all, this is a must-buy. It is absolutely fantastic. I could go on about how good this game is for a while, and I have criticized it during this, review, because I'm trying to be objective here, guys, because I struggled, okay? I struggled. I played this game for 10 hours, and I was like, okay, this is amazing. how am I going to review this? I played it for 30 hours. Okay, this is amazing. I hit 40. I almost considered not reviewing the game because I felt like, what can I add that the other reviewers haven't added? I thought they were kind of, overhyping the game. I was wrong. It is fantastic. If you have the money and you're remotely interested in role-playing games, just buy the game now, immediately, if you haven't bought it already.